Um, hello, everybody. That was a surprise. Okay. Wow. I was looking at the agenda and thinking I am in a Walensky-Foege sandwich, and it's a really good place to be. And I was totally not expecting to be in this palooza and with Rochelle's really, really over the top but kind and very meaningful comments. So thank you, Eric. Thank you, Rochelle, and thanks to all the EIS alumni and officers who are here. But I am here to introduce the Langmuir speaker today, Dr. Bill Foege. And for this audience, neither Bill Foege nor Alex Langmuir need any introduction. But the ham that I am not going to give up my 4 remaining minutes of the program just because you know who the speaker and the speaker's named person is. So Bill Foege has been beloved around the world and at CDC long after his day jobs ended. Eradicating smallpox from the world, inspiring multiple generations at CDC and in public health, guiding Bill and Melinda Gates to make global public health impact their top priority, and championing the science and management behind vaccines and vaccination in particular ought to be enough. But getting the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Obama, together with Bob Dylan, the icing on the cake. The thing about eradication is it's all about getting to zero. For this generation and for all future ones, getting to zero is difficult. It's not for sissies. So here is my brief musical tribute to Dr. Foege and getting to zero. And for those who haven't heard this, this is my terrible voice blasting out to 500 people. Imagine there's no smallpox. It's easy if you try. No polio or measles, don't have to tell you why. Imagine all the people asking for vaccines. Oh. Some may say he's a dreamer, but he's not the only one. We all share in his vision of the world when there will be none. EIS 70th anniversary celebration audience, I give you the world's Bill Foege.
Thank you, Anne. And I now understand the word inflation, but thank you anyway. And let me thank you also for everything that you have contributed to CDC. And my respect for you has only increased in the last year. I was able to give the address at the 50th anniversary of EIS and the 60th, and now the 70th. And I'm making notes for the 80th. At the 60th, I was introduced by Dave Sensor. And so Anne has continued the making introductions better than the speeches themselves. And so I thank you for that. I spoke this week at the downtown Kiwanis Club in Atlanta. And I said that George Bernard Shaw warned against getting people my age to give a speech because he said at 85, people have only one speech in them. So I apologize for those of you who have heard this speech twice, 3 times, maybe 4 times. I attended my first EIS conference 60 years ago. And to show you what a different time it was, one of the presentations was on rabies in a dog. And during the discussion period, Cecil Reinstein, a former EIS officer, then working in Grand Junction, Colorado, stood up and he said, I want to show you how we handle dog rabies in Colorado. And with that, he scared the daylights out of everyone, pulling a pistol out of his waistband and shooting a blank into the air. And I wondered, what have I gotten myself into? Three simple desires today. I'd like to say something about our vocation. Number two, I would like to give some highlights of our history. And number three, talk about some real challenges that we've never faced before. The best of the EIS efforts combine three things. Number one is good science, great science, and many people are afraid of science, and we've seen this allergy to science in recent years. But Huxley said science is simply common sense at its best. But the second thing to add is art. And Will Durant says that this gives creativity to science. And he said the first scientist that we actually know by name was Imhotep from Egypt. He was a physician, he designed the step pyramid, and then he built it. And I was reminded of this on January 6th, when our capital was invaded, because over 200 years ago, as our forefathers were looking for ideas on the architecture of the Capitol, the winning bid came from a physician. And so Will Durant says that provides creative common sense at its best. But there's a third part of this that came to us from Roger Bacon. Roger Bacon was born 800 years ago last year and was an intriguing scientist. I mean, he loved science. When the Pope asked him to do a summary of science, he did. And it's been over 50 years since I've looked at that summary. But I still recall his enthusiasm. He was enthusiastic about everything. He predicted cars and airplanes and submarines and telescopes. But he ended up by saying to the Pope, science has no moral compass. And so you have to create scientists with a moral compass. And once again, I say thank you to Anne for that. But if you add all three of those together, you have moral, creative, common sense at its best. This is not a bad description of what EIS seeks to have. What can new recruits to EIS expect? First of all, you will no longer have to explain to your family what an epidemiologist is. But second, the field has changed greatly. When I got into the EIS, infectious diseases constituted the vast majority of public health. And global was not even thought about. We thought about international health, which had a dichotomy between domestic and foreign health. But I tell people interested in going to the EIS or into public health in general, you probably will not get rich, and you will probably never be thanked, because people don't know what they didn't get. But if you can get beyond those two things, it's a very satisfying profession. An article recently said that CDC has lost its way. Instead of concentrating on infectious diseases as it should, it's involved in too many things. Well, the objective has always been threefold: to eliminate premature mortality, to eliminate unnecessary suffering, and to improve the quality of life. What has changed is we know so much more about the ingredients that cause the problem. And so we must, in good conscience, consider to look at poverty, racism, gender bias, illiteracy, unemployment as public health problems. A few things on the history of EIS and epidemiology. For those of us who are older, our introduction to epidemiology was, of course, Alex Langmuir. He was feared by many because an EIS officer would deliver a talk at the annual conference only to see Alex get up, go to the aisle to the microphone, and then ask a question that was at the core of the issue, but had not been thought of by the EIS officer. He was opinionated. And I remember one day when he was giving me the argument on a particular subject. And when he finished, I said, we should look at the arguments on the other side. And he slammed his fist onto his desk and he said, there is no other side. So he had very firm beliefs, and yet he was so kind when he would ask about the family and was genuinely concerned with what was happening. He was fond of featuring William Farr and John Snow and their work on cholera in London. And so John Snow became known as the father of epidemiology. And many of us have actually visited the pub where the Broad Street pump was to see where this all originated. And yes, John Snow was an early father of epidemiology, but Semmelweis came before him, and we forget that. But even before Semmelweis, we have Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., who did some of his study in Paris under Professor Louis, who was known as a clinical epidemiologist, which means epidemiology did exist before John Snow. And we forget the fact that Edward Jenner was doing epidemiologic observations on cowpox and smallpox 50 years before Snow. And we forget that Alexander, what's his name, was before Edward Jenner. And he wrote a paper saying he knew that something was happening between the hands of doctors and the sepsis seen in women postpartum. He said, I don't know what it is, but I know I'm guilty and I apologize. And he suggested doing hand washing. Yes, Alexander Gordon was his name. So there is no identifiable father or mother of epidemiology. And even the hunters used to figure out where they were likely to get game and where they were not likely to get game. But what is epidemiology? Alex used to say it is so simple. You simply have to get the right numerator, the right denominator, come up with a rate, and then interpret that rate. He said that's what epidemiology is. So it's a surprise that if this is the scientific base of public health, that we've only passed our first 100 years of having a department of epidemiology in the School of Public Health. Wade Hampton Frost started the first department of epidemiology at Johns Hopkins as they were forming their school. He was on loan from the Public Health Service, and he later became the dean of the school. Alex Langmuir took his training there. And while Wade Hampton Frost actually institutionalized epidemiology in our academic area, then we had Alex coming to CDC in 1949 and institutionalizing epidemiology in public health practice. And as you heard, his first job was to develop a SWAT team that we now know as EIS to look at and be able to control possible bioterrorist acts. Why was this important? Because at that time, the US thought China had introduced Korean hemorrhagic fever into the Korean conflict. In the 1970s, I was part of a team in China looking at the development of the barefoot doctor phenomenon. I was taken to a virology lab, and the head of virology was so excited about showing me around. And when I asked him about the origin of the lab, he said it was developed in the 1950s because China thought the US had introduced Korean hemorrhagic fever into the Korean conflict. It shows how little we knew about each other. In the 1950s, the EIS really developed its reputation, though, on polio. When Alex came to CDC in 1949, Tom Weller had just grown the polio virus in the lab. And 4 years later, Salk had developed a vaccine. Salk was so convinced that his vaccine was good and worked, he did not want a field trial, which today we would call a phase 3 trial. He said, we don't need it. It would be immoral to have a placebo group. Well, one of his mentors was Tommy Francis, a virologist who was the first person to isolate influenza virus. And Tommy Francis, and for some of you older EIS officers, Tommy Francis was the father-in-law of Russ Alexander, one of the first EIS officers at CDC. And Tommy Francis said, that's not the way science works. And so he headed up the field trial. And we think in terms of phase 3 studies now as having 30,000 or 40,000 people for the coronavirus vaccine. But polio shows up clinically with paralysis only once in 100 to once in 1,000 people with polio. So you need a larger cohort. And Tommy Francis did the field trial on 1.8 million children, hundreds of thousands of medical volunteers, hundreds of thousands of school volunteers. And the hallways at the University of Michigan were lined with files on all of the 1.8 million children. He did this in less than 2 years with no computers and no smartphones. It's just unbelievable that he could have done this. Well, then in April of 1955, he held the press conference to announce that the vaccine worked. It was protective. And Jonas Salk became a hero. On the fronts of magazines, the next day there were signs in windows of stores around the country, thank you, Dr. Salk. So he was at the peak of his popularity when 2 weeks later, children getting the vaccine began to develop polio. And the CDC started a surveillance program for polio overnight, only the second surveillance program for any disease nationally in this country, the first having been malaria 5 years earlier. So now there was a surveillance program and EIS officers fanned out, visiting every child with polio to get the details. And what was found is they had received their vaccine from Qatar, and Qatar had not killed all the virus in the vaccine. The other 3 manufacturers had no cases. And so because of the field trial and because of the EIS program, it was possible to save the program and say the other 3 manufacturers were giving vaccine that was safe. It's a remarkable thing. EIS was lauded, and that became the beginning of the reputation. The global role by CDC and EIS is very important, and you can understand that I'm interested in that, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over that and talk about the expansion of EIS programs in other ways. The change in draft laws suddenly made it possible to draft women, and this to the benefit of public health. CDC was reorganized in 1977, and we still had EIS officers going to infectious diseases, but now we had them going to occupational health, environmental health, and even to injury control and chronic diseases. With AIDS, we saw an increase in behavioral scientists going into the EIS, and gradually the idea of an EIS program spread globally, first to Canada and Thailand, and now to scores of countries. Many of us had a dream of an EIS program at WHO. And when Richard Schweiker was Secretary of Health and Human Services and about to go to the World Health Assembly to give a talk, he asked me, what could I offer WHO? And I told him he could offer that we would help in developing a WHO EIS program, but it turned out that WHO was not interested. What are the current challenges? And I'll mention only 5. One is that this threefold challenge of science, art, and a moral conscience still will be a problem forever, and we can't leave it to chance. We have to be thinking in that direction every time. Number two, we should improve our practice in looking at mental health problems, and we should increase our intrigue and study of the social elements that cause poor health. Number three, we should develop a usable surveillance system that chronicles what constitutes improved health at the end of an encounter with our hospitals and clinics. Now we give so much attention to rewarding people for the process rather than the outcome. And we are in the embarrassing situation of spending more money per individual on healthcare than any other country. And yet we can't even break into the top 10 countries for health outcomes. We can't even get into the top 15. We can't even get into the top 20. And this should be an embarrassment to all of us. If we developed a surveillance system that looks at health outcomes and could gradually reward people for the practices that improve health outcomes, think of the contribution that this could be. And we should pay attention to the problems that could cause the extinction of the human race. Steve Luby, who was an EIS officer, who's now at Stanford, tells us that nuclear weapons, global warming, synthetic biology, and artificial intelligence all contain the seeds of possible destruction of the human race. And we should be looking at that. Fifth and last, concerns something that troubles me greatly and didn't trouble me in the past. Our grandson, Max, has been working this last year with homeless people in California, and for the last several months with refugee children in Texas. And he's met many EIS officers in that assignment. I have always encouraged him to keep a journal, and 2 weeks ago, he shared part of his journal with me, and I immediately asked him, could I use this in a talk? He was reluctant, but he feels he owes us something, and so he agreed. And in his journal entry, he starts with the fact that he remembers me telling him a story when I put him to bed as a child. He asked for a story, and he did that every night. And I told him the story about the man who visited a fortune teller. And he was told, you're going to be very poor and very unhappy until you're 45. And he grasped at that straw and he asked the fortune teller, what will happen when I'm 45? And the fortune teller said, you're going to get used to it. And then Max's entry continues, and I read, I don't want to say over 500,000 Americans died from COVID-19 with the same emotional weight as when I say the emperor penguins are approximately 4.3 feet tall. I want to scream it for the rest of my life. I want that figure to force tears from my eyes. I want the fact that there are people who are suffering to keep me awake at night. No matter how long I live, I don't want to get used to it. And he brought forth with this all of the fury that I've felt over the last year. We learned an important lesson, a frightening lesson. We're not as good as we thought we were. Much of my reward over the past 60, 65 years in public health has been the people we work with. They have virtue as defined in the 18th century as public service above personal reward. We never had to doubt that. And so for my 65 years, I didn't question the motivation of public health colleagues. I didn't have to. Now there's a widespread perception that we let the country down this past year, and repeatedly CDC was gagged by the White House. Some public servants became private servants, and many were unable to speak and still retain the role of protecting public health. It hurts me greatly to have a senator say she no longer trusts CDC. And forget the irony of a politician in 2021 telling us who to trust. It still hurts. It hurts even more to have a public health member of the White House task force say she didn't trust what came from CDC. And that is what's causing me to relook at where we are. George Washington trusted his troops totally because he said they had virtue. They were patriotic for a new country. But before the Revolutionary War was over, he began to question this premise because he saw how power changed some people. And he began to talk about the need for checks and balances. But it was James Madison who brought this to the fore, who came up with all kinds of ideas that he presented at the Constitutional Congress. And because of that, we have the checks and balances in our political system. But now belatedly, while I had never thought of this before, I'm now wondering if we need checks and balances in public health. Rabbi Herschel said, in cases like this, some are guilty, but all are responsible. And my strongest criticism is for people like me. We had nothing to lose by speaking up, and we didn't. I kept thinking to myself, the White House task force is going to see the error of what they're doing and they will change because it's always happened in the past, but they didn't. It didn't have to happen. And by the time I spoke up, it was too late. The bottom line is we need to figure out how to put effective checks and balances into public health, and that needs to come from within, not something imposed from without. And we need to reestablish CDC as the gold standard, not by saying we are the gold standard, but by continuing to prove it every day that we are the gold standard. And the reputation will come back. We've had low points before. Congressman Murphy criticized CDC scientists without reserve during the Legionnaire days. He said scientists at CDC think they're scientists, but they're not compared to real scientists. He said if they were real scientists, they would recognize that Legionnaires is caused by a toxin and not by an organism. But he said they're so fixated because of their history on organisms that that's all they can see. When Dave Sensor called him to say we had isolated the causative organism of Legionnaires, Congressman Murphy said, well, it's about time. And 3 days later, he put out a statement that he had verified the cause of Legionnaires. I could leave this here, and I suppose that would be the polite thing to do, but I need to add that he later went to prison, not for criticizing CDC, but because he wasn't a very clever crook. And swine flu caused us problems. It was a point of controversy. But Dave Sensor did the right thing. And I had a chance at a hearing when Senator Kennedy asked me, what would you have done if you had been in Dave Sensor's shoes? And I said, I hope I would have had the courage to do exactly what he did. And then I explained why it was the right decision at that time, but it might not be in the future, because we now had an example of a new organism spread human to human with no immunity, not going into a pandemic. What went wrong this time? Well, not all bullies go into politics, but those that do find it a great environment to practice their approach. And public health got challenged by political bullies, and we didn't fight back. Under the last administration, it was possible to create a vaccine with bold new science in record time. And so one asks, how could we have done that under those politicians when they at the same time were able to block good public health practice, such things as knowing the truth, providing federal guidance, establishing coalitions, realizing the best decisions come from the best science, but the best results come from the best management. Always thinking globally, well, how could that have happened that they would have done this breakthrough with vaccines while blocking public health? Well, I think the reason is that many people feel supreme confidence in providing public health advice, even if dead wrong, saying the disease will disappear like magic. But few people feel confident they can make a vaccine. And so the same politicians could freely provide erroneous public health advice while giving money to NIH and to vaccine producers and not interfere. We should not draw the wrong conclusion. The lesson is not to keep politicians out of public health. The lesson is to keep bad politicians out of public health and out of public service in general. We need the good politicians because we're one part of medicine totally dependent on politicians. They are the ones that appropriate the money for us. So we need good ones involved. And when you think about it, this is really a successful single payer system. So the bottom line is we should propose checks and balances. We should train public health workers in political science. We should encourage them to go into politics until we have as many public health people as lawyers in Congress, and do everything we can to make sure public health workers are the best ancestors possible. We need to reestablish our leadership role with the global community. Normal in our country, we know, will not come until we have normality in India and Botswana and Sudan and Brazil and Uruguay. We need to lead a global vaccination effort as robust as the domestic effort, fast, with equity and strong leadership. It's in our interest to do this. Think what could happen if the US headed a program to vaccinate 1 billion people in 100 days and then speed up. So in summary, some of you may know Lincoln Stephan as a journalist of 100 years ago. He grew up in privilege. In fact, he grew up in the home that is now the governor's mansion in California. But he was always looking for problems in society. And 100 years ago, he wrote, "The greatest book has not been written. The greatest song has not been sung. And the greatest poem is yet to come." And so I can predict that the greatest EIS contributions still stand before us. But I can also predict that the greatest plague has not yet been seen. Thank you.